So I am now joined by Rene Rojas. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development at SUNY Binghamton. He's, of course, also on the editorial board of Catalyst, and he has been on the show many times before and has written for Jacobin about the Chilean presidential election and Chilean politics. Rene, great to see you.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you again.
So obviously, the big news out of Chile in recent weeks is that a majority of Chileans, unfortunately, voted to reject a proposed constitution, which was a sort of sweeping and transformative document that I think a lot of people were really hoping was going to go forward. I want to start by just asking you what was exactly in this constitution, because I think that there was a lot of excitement on the left about it. So maybe you could go through and kind of tell us what exactly was in it. And then, the obvious follow up question is, given that Chilean voters recently supported Boric in the presidential election, and prior to that, I believe, had voted to overhaul the prior constitution, why did this new progressive constitution fail to pass?
Yeah, well, that's the big question that
Yeah.
everyone on the left and beyond really is asking themselves right now. But let's start with the first question you asked about the contents of the draft that was written by the assembly,
Mhm.
by a new constitutional convention that was elected almost 2 years ago now. One way to describe the contents of the draft of this proposed charter is that it was just too much. It
Mm.
included far too many articles. It included mention of way too many rights and protections, and that led to both confusion and suspicion, I would say.
Mm.
Overall, I think you can divide the types of guarantees and rights and protections that were included into two big categories. And the distinction, actually, in my view, is crucial for understanding why Chileans rejected the draft. On one side, there are a number of articles that were written in to protect basic social needs
Mhm.
and to provide basic provision, social provision to cover these basic material needs like healthcare, like housing, like education, like retirement or pensions, I should say.
Mhm.
The Constitution did a pretty good job of guaranteeing that the state, right, would offer these protections and these goods, and that they would be universally available to Chileans. On the other hand, right, in a way that many didn't necessarily see as contrasting with the first set of rights and protections, the draft also included a number of narrower, you might want to call them identitarian or social justice type articles referring to social justice issues of all types. Um, but mainly, I think what was highlighted, right, were gender rights and protections, ethno-national rights and protections, rights for nature, and protections against environmental harm for people, um, but that were presented, I would say, not necessarily in universalist form, but presented as special protections for people suffering special, narrower types of oppression.
Mhm.
And I think what happened both over the course of the convention, which met for a year, from July of last year to July of this year, right? And since then, since the campaign for the plebiscite, the former set of rights and protections got totally eclipsed by
Mm.
and overshadowed and really drowned out by discussion and moralizing over the second set of rights.
Hmm.
And in my view, that more than anything is what turned off ordinary working Chileans. As you pointed out, in the opening plebiscite, the first referendum in which Chileans were asked whether they wanted to change the constitution, dispense with the 1980 constitution that was imposed under dictatorship, but has reigned ever since, and write a new one. nearly 80%, 78% of Chileans said, yes, we want a new constitution. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of public fervor for a constitutional overhaul. In
Mhm.
addition, when they were asked if they wanted to, or whom they wanted to write the constitution, they said, we don't trust the old political class. We want to vote in new representatives to draft the constitution, right?
Mhm.
80% of people voted on those 2 points in favor of change. And
Mhm.
this time around, only 38% did. So something happened in the interim, in the ensuing months, right, that really inverted really the national mood and public opinion. And I think, we can go into how it happened, but I think
Mhm.
more than anything, what people decided and what they rejected, right, was both the way the Constituent Assembly behaved and both the politics within it and the types of issues it prioritized, but also, again, as I said earlier, the content itself, which tended to bury, right, basic universal rights and protections under, an array of lofty and specially designed protections that Chileans didn't seem were directed at them or were intended to promote their well-being.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really interesting that you make this distinction between, I guess, the kind of universalist, economic bread and butter side of the Constitution, and then these more specialized or like identitarian concerns. Because obviously, this is a conversation that the American left has all the time, right? And
Yeah,
I think that what you hear a lot on the left is that if you don't sort of include or even center those social justice concerns, then you're going to be alienating very marginalized people in some way, or you're going to be throwing them under the bus. That's a kind of criticism that I hear all the time. And I want to bring that up in the context of the Chilean constitution, because at least in some of the initial reports that I've seen, and you probably know more, so maybe you can correct me on this, but it looks like a lot of indigenous voters, indigenous groups, voted to reject this constitution, which ostensibly was written with all of these protections for these groups in mind, right? And I also saw that a lot of high poverty areas in Chile also voted to reject, again, a constitution that was ostensibly created to sort of enshrine protections of these groups and, deliver them more rights and benefits.
right.
Again, I suppose this is just to ask you to expand a little bit on those comments. What explains this disjunct? I mean, that's very interesting, I think.
Yeah, you can add to that the fact that a significant majority of women, right,
Mm,
also rejected the Constitution,
right,
and this
right.
has been, hailed as a model for a feminist um, constitution that guarantees parity across the board, across social realms and institutions, and in spite of that, women also rejected it. My understanding is not that people are rejecting those special protections or those narrower kind of social justice oriented provisions in the Constitution. It's not that Chileans are just, sexist and they cannot have, right, parity
Right,
in
right.
society, or most Chileans who are, mestizo, mixed, reject indigenous rights or special protections for indigenous communities per se. I don't think that's what's going on, even though you're starting to hear a lot of this um, come out in Chile saying, look, we're just a conservative society. People on the left are starting to say this.
Mhm.
Voters are just backward and they don't know what's in their best interest. And so they reject these things. I don't think that's what it is. I think rather when those rights, right, are um, as I described earlier, right? When they receive all of the attention, when the proponents of the new constitution constantly, right, pointed out that we had to defend all social justice issues in very, as I said earlier, kind of moralizing terms, um, people started to feel that if that was the direction this was going in, it could not guarantee the broad, class-wide, universal demands that people have been making since the rebellion in 2019 and
Mhm.
before, right?
Mhm.
So it's not that people ordinarily place these things in competition with one another, and they think they're mutually exclusive, right? It's that this time around, proponents for the new constitution weren't able to convince Chileans, right, that the best way to actually um, guarantee those more particular set of rights is by prioritizing universal
Right.
provision of protections and goods. And so what happened is that, Chileans became confused, demoralized, and increasingly bitter.
Hmm.
You have to imagine a population. Remember, this is Chile, right? The poster child for deregulation,
Hmm.
liberalization, for the entire neoliberal turn, right? Where social provision has been commodified extensively, and where most working people have been facing conditions of really deep-seated material insecurity for decades, right? And so when the proponents of the new constitution sideline, in many ways, in the politics and the campaigning, sideline the universal provisions that people are clamoring for,
Hmm.
and insist on everyone getting on board and sacrificing. This is kind of language that was used to win these narrower rights. I think people concluded, look, these folks, these representatives, and this draft, they are not they do not have my best interest in mind,
Hmm.
right? You know, Again, I don't think that this means that Chileans are kind of by nature sexist,
Right.
racist, right? That's not it at all. It's that I think very reasonably the way that this all played out promoted very serious suspicions
Hmm.
on the part of ordinary working Chileans that this charter really would defend our basic class-wide universal rights.
Right. Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit more about how the process kind of broke down, because something else I've been sort of hearing in these postmortems of the Constitution is a lot of people have been focusing on the right in Chile, the organized right, and I think a lot of people have been looking at the kind of propaganda and or
Mhm.
misinformation campaign that the right waged against the Constitution. To what extent is the failure of this constitution a product of the right, of the Boric administration, or the activist left, as you've been hinting at?
Yeah. Well, clearly it's a combination of
Hmm.
everything, right? And what we have to do on the left is kind of tease these apart and then also rank them in a certain way in
Right.
terms of what was more or what had a deeper causal effects on the outcome and what we can actually address, right?
Yeah.
From the left. There's no doubt that propaganda and manipulation, all the fake news, both in regular, ordinary, traditional corporate media and in social media, did have an effect, right? Just to give you some examples, there were two big topics that came up over and over again, and that really, I think, fueled people's confusion and suspicion. One was what we've already mentioned, the rights that the Constitution would have conferred onto indigenous populations, and the refounding of Chilean society as a plurinational country where indigenous, especially the Mapuche population, would have a special set of institutions and protections. And then the other thing was housing, ironically,
Hmm.
right? Because the Constitution guaranteed housing, and propaganda um, actually was successful in convincing ordinary people that this meant that their houses would actually be taken away, and they would become public property, right? That the state would then decide how to distribute somewhat arbitrarily, right? Was kind of the message. Those two kind of types of propaganda hit home and did have an effect on people. However, I don't, obviously, they didn't do so in a vacuum. I don't
Hmm.
think that those types of media manipulations and that type of fake news, right, um, was automatically going to resonate among working Chileans. After all, if you think back to the time of the opening plebiscite, and I think it was October of 2020, all of that was in effect as well.
Hmm.
There was this huge propaganda campaign saying, Chile is going to turn into Venezuela.
Mm-hmm.
This whole Chilezuela um, theme that came up then. And if you want to end up like Venezuela, where millions of people are fleeing, where society is broken down, where no institutions work, where there's an exorbitant poverty level, then vote for the Constitution. Those scare tactics and that fear mongering was present then, but it didn't work,
Hmm.
right? So the real question for me is not just to try to measure the impact of propaganda this time around, but to understand why it worked, right, in last week, whereas it hadn't worked 2 years ago.
Hmm.
Ultimately, my one of my big concerns with the approach that um, tends to place a lot of emphasis on the fake news and on the fear mongering is that ultimately it blames ordinary Chileans.
Hmm.
Ultimately, it says, look, for some reason or another, Chileans are just susceptible to this stuff, and they'll always fall prey to it. Instead of concluding or instead of focusing, directing the analysis on what the left can do to make
Hmm.
sure that people are somewhat inoculated, right, against what will inevitably be a propaganda of disinformation, a campaign of propaganda and disinformation.
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess then, that brings us to the question of what comes next, right? You know, First of all, what do you think this referendum, the outcome of this referendum, sort of tells us about the state of the Chilean left at the moment? And what does this all mean for the future of the Boric administration and what kinds of challenges, not just the administration, but the left in general will be facing going
Yeah.
forward?
Well, I think we have to start from from the recognition that this is just a massive blow, a
Yeah.
massive defeat um, to the broader process of change and of systemic reform that was underway, to the Boric government and to the left more broadly.
Hmm.
The vote, again, 62% of Chileans very clearly, unequivocally saying, this is not what we want. What the left did and what the left is offering, right, is not what we want.
Right.
That amounts to a huge setback. And we're only now, I think, starting to grapple with the magnitude of its consequences. Um, I, let me just start with what this might mean for the constituent process itself,
Hmm.
right? There's debate now as to what will happen. After all, 2 years ago, 80% of Chileans said they wanted a new constitution. It is kind of firmly established in Chilean society that the 1980 constitution has lost legitimacy, and people do not want it. So that leaves open the question: well, considering this defeat, how do we move forward in terms of constitutional reform? Um, and this debate is kind of raging among the political class as we speak. My thoughts are that the Constitution, the current 1980 Constitution, will be reformed.
Hmm.
Right? There's no way that the Boric government and the entire political class can avoid that. But given again the blow that we've just received, right? The right and the old centrist political class, which dominated Chilean politics from 1990 until very recently, right, has been they've been revived, and they're going to exert enormous influence, and they're going to also exercise veto power on any steps moving forward. And so they're probably going to ask for a mixed assembly that includes some elected representatives along with current parliamentarians and a set of experts who will rewrite the Constitution and then submit it again to a popular referendum. But of course, that means that all the reforms that Chileans have been out on the street for, or at least were, that they went into rebellion, pursuing in 2019, all those reforms that had again been firmly placed on the agenda the national agenda will be watered down significantly.
Hmm.
In terms of the Boric government, I think it's quite open. Anywhere from him, just being the government being dead in the water and just seeing how he somehow rides out the remainder of his tenure, which is 3+ years,
Hmm.
to him being severely straitjacketed and shackled by, again, this um, uh, old tradition, the political class of the old order, which has regained confidence, which is trying to reassert itself, and now has the backing of this result with which to do it.
Hmm.
So I think right now Boric is going to have to turn toward the center. He's already reshuffled his cabinet. He's brought in people from the old center left, and they're going to have, I think, really uh, primary influence over his program from now on. Once again, that means severely moderating, even abandoning core reforms that he campaigned on. I think lastly, there's the question of, if we still have a little time, what this means for the broader left.
Yeah.
And it's tough because I'm not sure the left has drawn the right conclusions
Mm.
about why this occurred. There again, as I said earlier, there is an important segment that comes out of this middle class activist layer, right? You might want to, I don't want to sound too pejorative, but you might call them social justice warriors, right? That have a lot of influence because they rose out of real mass movements
Hmm.
over the past 10 years. There are segments among them that, as I said earlier, blame ordinary Chileans. I think Chileans are either backward
Hmm.
or they're just somehow way too susceptible to right-wing propaganda. Well, if that's your read, then your conclusion is we have to go out there and do even more of what we did. We have to preach at people, even with louder, stronger voices to convince them that they're wrong and that these, reforms, the way we have formulated them, are the way to go. That's a dead end. That's a losing strategy, which will only result in a further weakening of the left.
Yeah.
Of course, the Boric, I think what Boric has concluded, that he has attacked to the center, is also in the longer haul, all right, a dead end strategy, because all it will do is reinforce the very insecurities, the very problems that led to the mass rebellion in 2019 in the first place. And I think there's awareness of that. What I think the left should do is to um, double down on its message, but not the kind of identitarian social justice issues, rather the universalist causes that it did partially, right, put on the agenda and fight for over these last 3 years. That's the way to win over, um, you know, huge swaths of the working population that went from approving a new constitution
Hmm.
to rejecting it. And
Hmm.
that doesn't mean, of course, abandoning as we were saying earlier, these more particular fights against these more particular forms of oppression. Doesn't mean abandoning the fight against sexism, and doesn't mean abandoning the fights for protections and rights for the Mapuche population whatsoever. But what
Hmm.
it does entail is going out there, recognizing people's needs, recognizing what people have been demanding, and showing through, right, political fight, that these two sets of issues are not incompatible
Right.
one with
Yeah.
one another.
Yeah.
Now, some people have concluded it's too much of an uphill climb. After all, as you said, there's data that says that among the poorest Chileans, 25%, only 25% voted for, and up to 75% voted to reject this. Right. Well, that seems to mean it's really going to be hard inserting ourselves into these communities, into these neighborhoods, into these work sites, right, to work with people, um, and win them over to a kind of materialist, universalist left. But I want to just say one thing as we approach the end of this conversation. The 25% figure that's been thrown out there a lot, I think is somewhat misleading. The stat actually is the following: that among the poorest towns or townships, comunas, as they're called, the municipalities, if you will, in Chile, among the poorest ones, the average was that 25% of residents there voted against. But most of those towns, those comunas, are actually small provincial municipalities. In either the south central or the far southern districts of the country. The fact of the matter is that most of Chile's working class is concentrated around the capital
Mhm.
and around the kind of middle region that includes ports like Valparaiso, which is the main port, and also San Antonio, another very important port through which most of what Chile sells to the world gets transported. In places like that, so in the big comunas in Santiago's metropolitan region, I'm talking about townships that concentrate most of the Chilean working class, right? 50% voted for apruebo, right?
Mhm.
And so I think there are leading segments of the working population, if you will, who, uh, you know, in in large numbers and significant numbers, right, are still on board. They still want a reform, and despite all the confusion, despite all the suspicion and mistrust that the Constituent Assembly and the campaign process um, provoked in them, are still behind a reform program, right?
Yes.
And so for me, that's where the left has to be.
Mhm. Yeah.
We have to recognize their needs, meet them, right, and take their grievances seriously, right, and allow ourselves to be disciplined by what they're demanding, the way they see the world, and not the way college educated activists see the world.
Right. Well said. Rene Rojas, again, is an editor over at Catalyst, and we will link some of his writing on Chile below. Rene, thank you so much for your time. That was great. Great to see you as always.
Always, yeah, it's a pleasure.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.